Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want you to picture the boardroom of a gleaming tech company in downtown Chicago, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlook Lake Michigan and success stories are born every day. The kind of place where young entrepreneurs in expensive suits make million-dollar deals and speak confidently about disrupting entire industries. But what those confident voices don't tell you is that sometimes the most crucial investor in the room is the one person nobody bothers to notice. The woman in the simple dress sitting quietly in the back, the one they assume couldn't possibly understand their world of venture capital and market valuations. Tonight, I want to tell you about the day I discovered that my own son had spent 5 years telling everyone he was a self-made millionaire, while the woman who made it all possible was sitting right there, invisible. My name is Margaret Sullivan, though everyone's called me Maggie for as long as I can remember. I'm 64 years old, and for the past 19 years, I've been the owner and CEO of Sullivan Cleaning Services here in the Chicago suburbs. When I tell people what I do for a living, I see that familiar look cross their faces, the one that says they've already decided what kind of person I am, what kind of life I've lived, what I'm capable of understanding. It's a look I've grown used to, especially in the business world where a woman my age who started with a mop and bucket doesn't exactly command immediate respect. But here's what those people don't know about Sullivan Cleaning Services. We don't just clean office buildings and suburban homes. We're a full-service facility management company with contracts worth over $12 million annually. We employ 230 people across 3 states, provide health insurance and retirement benefits to every full-time employee, and maintain the facilities for some of the biggest corporations in the Midwest. What started as me scrubbing floors to feed my 7-year-old son after my husband died has become something I never imagined possible. Robert, my husband, died in a construction accident when our son Brian was just 7 years old. The life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses, and suddenly I was a single mother with a mortgage, a grieving child, and absolutely no idea how I was going to keep us afloat. I had a high school education and experience as a stay-at-home mom, which doesn't exactly open doors in the corporate world. So I did what I had to do. I started cleaning houses for neighbors, then office buildings at night after Brian went to bed. Every dollar I earned went toward keeping our little house on Maple Street and making sure Brian never felt like he was missing out on anything his friends had. Those early years were brutal. I'd drop Brian at school, clean houses all day, pick him up, help with homework, make dinner, and then head out to clean office buildings until 2 in the morning. My hands were raw from chemicals, my back ached constantly, and I fell asleep in church more Sundays than I care to admit. But Brian was thriving. He made honor roll every semester, played basketball, went to science camp every summer, and never once heard me complain about being tired or worried about money. By the time Brian was in high school, Sullivan Cleaning Services had grown beyond anything I dreamed. I had 15 employees, contracts with major office complexes, and enough income to start thinking about Brian's college future. But I also had something else. I'd learned to read financial statements, understand profit margins, recognize good investments, and most importantly, I'd learned that successful businesses are built on relationships, trust, and reliability. These weren't lessons you learn in business school. They were lessons you learn at 3 in the morning, mopping floors and making sure every detail was perfect because your reputation depended on it. When Brian got accepted to Stanford for his MBA, I was so proud I cried for 3 days straight. The tuition was astronomical, more money than I'd ever imagined spending on anything. But I'd been saving and planning for years, and Sullivan Cleaning Services was generating enough profit to handle it. I wrote that first tuition check with shaking hands, thinking about all the nights I'd worked while Brian slept, all the sacrifices that had led to this moment. My son was going to have opportunities I'd never dreamed of. During his MBA program, Brian would call me with these incredible ideas about technology and startups. He had this vision for a software company that would revolutionize how service industries managed their operations. As he explained it to me, I realized he was essentially describing a digital version of everything I'd been doing manually with Sullivan Cleaning Services for years. Scheduling, inventory management, quality control, client communication. The kid was brilliant, but he was also describing problems I'd already solved in the real world. When Brian graduated and announced he wanted to start his own company instead of taking a corporate job, most mothers might have panicked. But I saw something different. I saw my son's Stanford education combined with my 19 years of hands-on business experience. I saw an opportunity to build something together, even if he didn't realize that's what was happening. So when he asked for help with startup capital, I didn't hesitate. I wrote him a check for $400,000, money I'd earned scrubbing floors and building relationships one client at a time. But here's the thing about pride, especially male pride in business. Brian needed to feel like he was making it on his own. So when I gave him that money, we structured it as a loan. When he needed more money 6 months later for office space and employees, we called that a loan too. And when the company needed another $1 million to scale up operations, well, that was just another loan from his supportive mother who happened to have done well in the cleaning business. What Brian didn't quite grasp, and what I didn't push him to understand at the time, was that those weren't really loans in any traditional sense. They were investments. And the woman who'd built a $12 million business from nothing understood exactly what those investments meant in terms of ownership, equity, and control. The first time I noticed something changing in Brian was about 2 years after his company was launched. He'd moved from the modest office space. I'd helped him rent into this sleek downtown high-rise with views that probably cost more per month than most people's salaries. When I visited, I barely recognized my son in his tailored suits and expensive watch, speaking in corporate jargon that seemed designed to exclude rather than include. But I was proud. This was what all those years of sacrifice had been building toward. It was during one of these visits that Brian casually mentioned he was dating someone new. Madison Patterson, he said, as if the name should mean something to me. When I looked confused, he explained that the Pattersons owned half the commercial real estate in Chicago's financial district. Old money, he called it, the kind of family that had streets and hospital wings named after them. I smiled and told him I was happy for him, but something in his tone made me uneasy. It was the way he said, "old money," like it was something sacred, something that mattered more than the kind of money I'd earned with my own hands. The invitation to their engagement party arrived on thick, cream-colored paper with gold embossing. The kind of invitation that probably cost more than most people spend on dinner. It was being held at the Riverside Country Club, and the dress code was listed as cocktail attire. I spent 3 weeks shopping for the right dress, settling on a navy blue number that cost more than I'd ever spent on clothes in my life. I wanted to look like I belonged, like I was worthy of standing next to my successful son and his sophisticated fiancée. Walking into that country club was like entering a different world. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors, and waiters in white gloves carried silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably had French names I couldn't pronounce. The guests all seemed to know each other, speaking in that casual way that comes from generations of shared privileges. I stood near the entrance for a moment, smoothing down my dress and checking my reflection in the ornate mirrors that lined the foyer. That's when I first laid eyes on Madison Patterson. She was everything I'd expected and nothing I'd prepared for. Tall, blonde, with the kind of effortless elegance that comes from never having to worry about money or question whether you deserve to be in any room you enter. Her engagement ring caught the light as she gestured while speaking, and I found myself wondering if it cost more than my house. She was surrounded by a circle of women who looked like variations of herself, all perfectly styled and radiating that confidence that comes from never having been told you don't belong somewhere. I approached slowly, rehearsing what I'd say. I was the mother of the groom, after all. This should have been one of the proudest moments of my life. But as I got closer, I could hear fragments of their conversation, and something in Madison's tone made me stop just outside their circle. "The most important thing," Madison was saying to her friends, "is making sure everyone understands their role in the wedding. We can't have any confusion about who belongs where." Her friends nodded knowingly, and one of them, a redhead with a strand of pearls that probably cost more than my car, laughed and said something about keeping the help in line. Before I could announce myself, one of the waiters approached our group with a tray of champagne. Madison turned. Ed to him with a bright smile and said, "Oh, perfect. Could you also check on the woman by the door? I think she might be looking for the service entrance." She gestured casually in my direction, and suddenly all eyes were on me. My cheeks burned as I realized what had just happened. In my navy dress and carefully styled hair, standing in the foyer of the country club where my son was celebrating his engagement, I had been mistaken for the help. The waiter, clearly unsure how to handle the situation, looked confused as he glanced between Madison and me. That's when Brian appeared, looking impossibly handsome in his tuxedo, his arms sliding around Madison's waist with casual possession. "Ladies," he said with that charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 5 years old, "I hope you're all having a wonderful time." This was my moment. This was when my son would introduce me to his fiancée and her friends, when he would tell them about the woman who had raised him, supported him, believed in him. I waited for the words that would restore my dignity, that would make this awkward moment into a funny story we'd laugh about later. "Brian," Madison said, still not realizing who I was, "your event coordinator really should have been clearer about which entrance the service staff should use. This woman seems a bit lost." I watched my son's face as he looked at me, really looked at me, standing there in my expensive dress with my carefully styled hair, being mistaken for hired help by the woman he was going to marry. I waited for him to correct the misunderstanding, to introduce me with pride, to claim me as his mother. Instead, Brian's eyes flickered with something I'd never seen before: embarrassment. Not embarrassment for Madison's mistake, but embarrassment for me. In that split second, I watched him make a choice that would change everything between us. "Oh," he said with a laugh that sounded forced, "this is Margaret Sullivan. She's a family friend, known her forever." He turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet my fiancé, Madison Patterson." A family friend. After everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd built for him, I had been reduced to a family friend. Not his mother, not the woman who had worked 3 jobs to put him through school, not the business owner who had funded his dreams. Just Margaret, the family friend who didn't quite fit into this glittering world he'd entered. Madison extended her hand with the kind of polite smile reserved for people you'll never see again. "How lovely to meet you, Margaret. Any friend of Brian's is welcome here." Her tone was gracious, but distant, the way you might speak to your cleaning lady when you remembered to acknowledge her existence. I shook her hand, my mind reeling from what had just happened. Around us, the party continued, crystal glasses clinking and elegant laughter floating through the air like music. But all I could hear was the echo of my son's voice introducing me as a family friend, and all I could see was the relief in his eyes when Madison and her friends turned their attention back to wedding planning and charity galas, and all the things that people like them discussed at parties like this. Standing there in my navy dress, holding a glass of champagne I could no longer taste, I realized that somewhere between the struggling single mother who scrubbed floors at midnight and the successful CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, I had become invisible. Not just to Madison and her friends, but to my own son. The boy I had raised to value character over connections, substance over status, had looked at me in that moment and decided I wasn't worth claiming. The rest of the engagement party passed in a haze of polite conversation and forced smiles. I found myself relegated to the edges of every group, making small talk with other family friends who seemed equally uncertain about their place in this glittering hierarchy. Madison's mother, Eleanor Patterson, swept through the room like a queen holding court, air-kissing guests and making pronouncements about wedding plans with the authority of someone who had never been told no about anything in her life. When Eleanor finally approached me, it was with the kind of calculated politeness that wealthy women use when they're performing charity. "Margaret, isn't it?" she said, though we'd been introduced only an hour earlier. "How wonderful that Brian has maintained friendships from his earlier days. It speaks so well of his character that he hasn't forgotten where he came from." The way she said "earlier days" made it sound like Brian had emerged from some Dickensian poverty rather than a perfectly respectable middle-class upbringing. But I smiled and nodded, playing the part I'd apparently been assigned. Brian's always been loyal, I managed to say, though the words felt like sand in my mouth. Oh yes, Leaner continued, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured toward where Brian and Madison stood surrounded by admirers. Madison is so impressed with how he's built his company from nothing. Completely self-funded, you know. Such an inspiration in this day and age when so many young people expect handouts from their families. She paused, studying my face with the sharp eyes of a woman who had spent decades categorizing people by their usefulness. Of course, coming from modest means as he did, I'm sure he learned the value of hard work early on. Self-funded. The word hit me like a physical blow. I excused myself and retreated to the ladies' room, needing a moment to process what I'd just heard. In the mirror, I looked like exactly what I was, a woman in her 60s who had worked hard for everything she had, wearing an expensive dress that couldn't quite disguise her working-class origins. But I was also something else, something that apparently no one in this room knew. I was the person who had funded Brian's self-made success. When I returned to the party, I positioned myself near the bar where I could observe without being noticed. It was a skill I'd developed over the years in business. Sometimes the most valuable information comes from listening rather than talking. What I heard over the next hour changed everything I thought I knew about my son. A group of Brian's business associates had gathered near the windows overlooking the golf course, their conversation animated with the kind of energy that comes from discussing serious money. I recognized a few faces from the company's board meetings I'd attended as a silent partner, though apparently my silence had been more complete than I'd realized. The beauty of Brian's operation, one of them was saying, a venture capitalist named Davidson whom I'd met several times, is that he's never had to answer to outside investors. Complete creative control because he bootstrapped the whole thing. Another man, someone I didn't recognize, raised his glass in admiration. That's the American dream right there. A kid from nowhere builds a $50 million company with nothing but vision and determination. No family money, no silver spoon, just pure entrepreneurship. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for someone to correct this narrative. Surely someone knew the truth about the funding, about the loans that weren't really loans, about the woman who had made it all possible. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that Brian's original story had been carefully crafted to exclude any mention of outside financial support. Must have been living on ramen noodles for years, Davidson laughed. I remember when he first pitched the company. The kid was wearing a suit that looked like it came from a thrift store, but his business plan was rock solid. You could tell he'd put every penny he had into the idea. The thrift store suit. I remembered that suit. I had bought it for Brian when he couldn't afford proper business attire for investor meetings. It had cost me $300 at a men's warehouse, a significant expense at the time, but I'd wanted him to look professional. Now it was being used as evidence of his humble, self-funded beginnings. That's when I heard Brian's voice cutting through the ambient noise of the party. He was standing with Madison's father, Richard Patterson, a man whose real estate empire had been built over 3 generations, and who, according to the society pages, was worth somewhere north of $200 million. They were having what appeared to be a serious conversation near the French doors that led to the terrace. I moved closer, using a marble pillar as cover, telling myself I was just being a concerned mother who wanted to make sure her son was making a good impression on his future father-in-law. But what I heard made my blood run cold. "The thing you have to understand, Richard," Brian was saying in a voice I barely recognized, confident, almost arrogant, "is that I'm not like these other entrepreneurs who come from money and use family connections to get ahead. Everything I've built myself, my mother. Well, she's a sweet woman, but she never understood business. She runs a small cleaning service, basic stuff, nothing sophisticated. I learned early on that if I wanted to succeed, I'd have to do it entirely on my own." Richard Patterson nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I want to hear. Madison's mother was concerned about, well, about backgrounds and whether you might have financial entanglements that could complicate things down the road. But a self-made man who's built something substantial without family money, that's impressive." "Trust me," Brian continued, and I could hear him warming to his theme. My mother thinks she's entitled to some credit for my success because she raised me, but the reality is, she's never contributed anything meaningful to my Busine. She has this gold digger mentality, thinking that just because she's my mother, she somehow deserves a piece of what I've worked for. I've had to be very clear about boundaries. Gold digger. The words echoed in my head like a slap. My own son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, was calling me a gold digger. The woman who had built a $12 million business from nothing, who had funded his education and his startup, who had asked for nothing in return except the pride of watching him succeed, was being dismissed as someone with a gold digger mentality. Richard chuckled, a sound like ice clinking in expensive whiskey. Well, that's the burden of success, isn't it? Everyone wants a piece of what you've built. The important thing is that you've clearly established that your achievements are your own. Madison will appreciate that. She's very protective of the family's financial interests. Of course, Brian replied smoothly. And just to be completely transparent, I've made sure there are no legal entanglements. Everything is clearly documented as loans that I'll pay back when convenient, but there's no ownership stake involved. My mother doesn't understand corporate structure anyway. She just sees numbers in a bank account. Loans that he'll pay back when convenient. No ownership stake. The casual dismissal of my business acumen. The reduction of my carefully structured investments to simple loans from a naive mother who just sees numbers in a bank account. I stood there behind that marble pillar, in my expensive dress at my son's engagement party, listening to him systematically erase me from his success story. The worst part wasn't even the financial betrayal, devastating as that was. It was the contempt in his voice when he spoke about me, the way he painted me as some grasping, simple-minded woman who didn't understand her place. This was how my son really saw me, not as the business partner who had made his dreams possible, but as an embarrassment to be managed and minimized. I stayed behind that pillar for several more minutes, listening to Brian and Richard move on to discuss golf handicaps and vacation homes, their conversation flowing as smoothly as if they'd just been discussing the weather rather than dismantling my entire relationship with my son. When I finally emerged, I felt like I was seeing the party through different eyes. Every polite smile felt like mockery. Every casual dismissal stung like a fresh wound. As I made my way toward the exit, Madison appeared at my elbow with that practiced smile that had probably been perfected at finishing school. "Leaving so soon, Margaret? I hope you enjoyed the party. It was so nice of you to come celebrate with us." I looked at this young woman who would soon be my daughter-in-law, who would share a life with the son I'd raised and supported and loved beyond measure, and I realized she had no idea who I really was. To her, I was just Margaret, the family friend, the cleaning lady who'd gotten above herself by attending a country club party. "It was lovely," I managed to say. "Congratulations to you both." And then I walked out into the Chicago night, leaving behind the crystal chandeliers and polite laughter, and my son's carefully constructed world, where I existed only as a footnote to his self-made success story. The drive home from the country club felt like traveling through a different universe. Every streetlight that passed seemed to illuminate another memory, another moment of sacrifice that had apparently been forgotten, or, worse, deliberately erased. By the time I pulled into my driveway on Maple Street, the house that had been our sanctuary for so many years looked smaller somehow, less significant against the backdrop of crystal chandeliers and marble floors I'd just left behind. I sat in my car for a long time, engine off, staring at the front porch where Brian had played as a child, where I'd helped him with homework on summer evenings, where we'd celebrated his acceptance to Stanford with takeout pizza, because it was all I could afford that night. The woman who had sat on that porch, dreaming of her son's future success, could never have imagined she'd one day be called a gold digger by the very child she'd worked herself to exhaustion to support. Inside, I kicked off the expensive shoes that had been pinching my feet all evening and went straight to my home office. If there was one thing 19 years of running a business had taught me, it was the importance of documentation. Every contract, every receipt, every email, I kept records of everything. And tonight, I needed to see those records with fresh eyes, to understand exactly what my loans to Brian really meant in legal and financial terms. The filing cabinet in the corner held the story of Brian's company in neat manila folders. I pulled them out one by one, spreading the documents across my desk like pieces of a puzzle I was seeing clearly for the first time. The initial loan agreement for $400,000, signed when Brian was still operating out of a shared workspace. The amendment 6 months later for another $300,000 when he needed to hire developers. The additional $800,000 when the company started scaling rapidly and needed proper office space and equipment. But these weren't just loan documents. As I read through them carefully, I could see the careful legal language that my attorney, James Morrison, had insisted on including. Conversion clauses, equity provisions, language that protected my interests as more than just a lender. Brian had signed everything without reading the fine print, trusting his mother to keep things simple and straightforward. He had no idea he was signing partnership agreements disguised as loan documents. The numbers told a story that was impossible to ignore. Brian's company, TechFlow Solutions, had received exactly $2.3 million in funding over its 5-year existence. Every penny had come from Sullivan Cleaning Services profits, from money I'd earned scrubbing floors and building client relationships and growing a business from nothing. According to the most recent valuation report, prepared for the upcoming IPO that Brian was so excited about, the company was now worth $50 million. I pulled out my calculator and started working through the numbers. If Brian's story about being self-funded were true, his $2.3 million investment would represent 100% ownership of a company now worth $50 million. But that wasn't his investment, it was mine. And according to the documents he'd signed, my $2.3 million entitled me to 47% ownership of TechFlow Solutions. 47% of $50 million. $23.5 million. That was what my gold digger mentality had earned. I leaned back in my office chair, the magnitude of the situation washing over me. My son, who was about to marry into one of Chicago's wealthiest families, who lived in a penthouse and wore $1,000 suits, who spoke casually about his self-made success, was a minority partner in his own company. The majority owner was the woman he'd just dismissed as a simple cleaning lady who didn't understand business. But it wasn't just about the money, devastating as that revelation was. It was about 5 years of board meetings where I'd sat quietly in the back, letting Brian take credit for strategic decisions that came directly from my decades of business experience. It was about investor presentations where he'd talked about bootstrapping and organic growth, while never mentioning the woman whose profitable company had made it all possible. It was about watching him build a reputation as a brilliant young entrepreneur, while systematically erasing my contributions from the narrative. I thought about all the times Brian had called for advice, not about technology, which was his expertise, but about personnel management, client relations, scaling operations, financial planning. All the areas where my experience with Sullivan Cleaning Services had given me hard-won knowledge. He'd always framed these conversations as a son asking his mother for general life advice, but now I could see them for what they really were. A business partner consulting with the person who'd built and run a successful multi-million-dollar operation. The irony was bitter and perfect. Eleanor Patterson had praised Brian for learning the value of hard work from his modest background, never realizing that his mother had built a business significantly larger and more profitable than many of the companies her social circle invested in for fun. Richard Patterson had been impressed by Brian's lack of family money, not knowing that the family money was substantial enough to make Brian's success possible, just not old enough or socially connected enough to matter in their world. I pulled out my laptop and started researching TechFlow Solutions' public profile. The company website had an About Us section with Brian's biography that read like a carefully crafted fairy tale. Founder and CEO Brian Sullivan started TechFlow Solutions with nothing but a vision and determination to revolutionize service industry management. A self-funded startup that has grown through organic expansion and innovative technology solutions. Not a word about investors, partners, or outside funding. According to this version of reality, Brian had somehow conjured $2.3 million out of thin air and built a $50 million company through sheer force of will. The woman who had provided the funding, the business expertise, and the ongoing strategic guidance was nowhere to be found in this story. I clicked through news articles about the company, interviews with Brian, industry profiles that painted him as the poster child for American entrepreneurship. In every single piece, the narrative was the same. Brilliant young founder bootstraps his way to success, proves that innovation and hard work can overcome any obstacle. CLE represents the best of American business values. The best of American business values. I almost laughed at the bitter irony. Here was a man who had built his reputation on a foundation of lies, who had taken credit for work and investment that weren't his, who had systematically erased his business partner from company history, being held up as an example of ethical entrepreneurship. My phone buzzed with a text message. Brian, thanks for coming tonight, Mom. I know this crowd isn't really your scene, but it meant a lot to me to have you there. Love you. I stared at that message for a long time. The casual dismissal. This crowd isn't really your scene. As if the problem were my inability to fit in rather than his deliberate exclusion of me from his success story. The patronizing tone, as if he were doing me a favor by allowing me to witness his triumph. The love you that felt hollow against the memory of him calling me a gold digger just hours earlier. I set the phone aside without responding and returned to the documents spread across my desk. Tomorrow, I would call James Morrison and ask him to review every agreement, every contract, every piece of paper that connected me to Tech Flow Solutions. I would ask him to calculate exactly what my legal position was, what my rights were as a 47% owner of a company about to go public. But tonight, I just sat in my home office surrounded by the evidence of my life's work, trying to reconcile the woman who had built Sullivan Cleaning Services from nothing with the woman who had just been dismissed as a gold digger by her own son. Outside, the suburban Chicago night was quiet and peaceful, the kind of night when successful families in comfortable homes count their blessings and plan their futures. Inside, a mother discovered that sometimes the child you love most in the world can break your heart in ways you never imagined possible. And sometimes the biggest betrayal comes not from strangers or competitors, but from the person you trusted with everything you had built. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, watching the sun rise over the suburban Chicago skyline and trying to figure out how I'd become invisible in my own life. By 7 in the morning, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was going to call James Morrison, the attorney who'd helped me structure Brian's funding agreements, and I was going to find out exactly what legal rights I had as a business partner who'd been systematically erased from company history. James had been my lawyer for 15 years, ever since Sullivan Cleaning Services had grown large enough to need serious legal counsel. He was one of the few people who knew the complete financial picture of my relationship with Brian's company, because he'd been the one drafting the agreements that protected my interests while allowing Brian to maintain his pride. When I called his office at 8 sharp, his secretary put me through immediately. "Maggie," James said, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "Everything all right? You sound like you've been up all night." "I have been," I admitted. "James, I need you to review every document we have regarding Tech Flow Solutions. I need to know exactly what my legal position is, what my rights are, and what my options are if I decide to exercise those rights." There was a pause at the other end of the line. James had been practicing corporate law for 30 years, and he'd developed a sixth sense for when a client was preparing for battle. "What happened, Maggie?" I told him about the engagement party, about being introduced as a family friend, about overhearing Brian dismiss me as a gold digger with no business acumen. I told him about the company's public narrative of being completely self-funded, about Brian's carefully constructed reputation as a bootstrap entrepreneur. By the time I finished, James was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Jesus, Maggie," he finally said. "I always wondered if this arrangement might blow up eventually, but I never imagined it would be this ugly. Look, can you come this morning? I want to pull all the files and go through this systematically. Because if what you're telling me is accurate, your son has a very serious problem. 2 hours later, I was sitting in James's downtown office, watching him spread legal documents across his mahogany conference table like a general planning a military campaign. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the Chicago River, and in the distance, I could see the building where Brian's company occupied 3 floors of premium office space that my money had helped him afford. "All right," James said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Let's start with the basic facts. Over 5 years, you've provided $2.3 million to Tech Flow Solutions, every agreement. ENT was structured to protect your interests as more than just a lender. The conversion clauses I insisted on are ironclad. At any time, you can convert your loans to equity ownership at the original valuation rates." He pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. The first $400,000 was provided when the company had essentially no value. That gives you a significant ownership percentage right there. The additional funding came as the company grew, but still at valuations far below the current $50 million estimate. Conservatively, you own 47% of Tech Flow Solutions. And with the IPO planned for next year, that 47% could be worth substantially more than the current private valuation. 47%. I'd known the number intellectually, but hearing James say it in his measured legal voice made it real. I wasn't just a creditor who'd been disrespected. I was the largest single shareholder in a company about to go public, and I'd been completely excluded from the decision-making process. "What about the fact that Brian's been telling everyone the company is self-funded?" I asked. "What about all the public statements, the investor presentations, the media interviews where he claims to have bootstrapped everything?" James's expression darkened. "That's where this gets really problematic for him. Securities law is very clear about disclosure requirements, especially for companies preparing to go public. If Brian has been misrepresenting the ownership structure to potential investors, if he's been claiming assets and achievements that legally belong to you, we're looking at potential fraud charges. The SEC takes these things very seriously." He pulled out another folder, this one containing printouts of news articles and company press releases. "I've been following Tech Flow's progress in the business press, and you're right, every single public statement presents Brian as the sole founder and owner. There's no mention of outside investors, no acknowledgement of your role in either funding or strategic development." "But I signed agreements to be a silent partner," I protested. "I specifically said I didn't want public recognition because I didn't want to embarrass him by making it look like he needed his mother's help." "Silent partner doesn't mean invisible partner," James replied firmly. "And it certainly doesn't mean allowing your partner to commit securities fraud by misrepresenting the company's ownership structure. Maggie, what your son has done goes far beyond embarrassment or hurt feelings. He's built his entire professional reputation on a lie, and that lie is about to become very expensive if this company goes public with fraudulent ownership disclosures." I felt a strange mix of vindication and horror. Vindication because someone finally understood the magnitude of what had been done to me. Horror because the implications for Brian could be devastating. What are my options? James leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers in the way he did when he was thinking through complex legal strategies. "Legally, you have several options. You could demand immediate recognition of your ownership stake and a seat on the board of directors. You could require that all public statements be corrected to reflect the true ownership structure. You could block the IPO until proper disclosures are made. Or," he paused, studying my face carefully, "you could exercise your conversion rights and demand immediate transfer of your 47% equity stake, which would effectively make you the controlling shareholder." Controlling shareholder. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I thought about Brian in his expensive suits, speaking confidently to investors about his self-made success. I thought about Madison and her family, so impressed with his bootstrap entrepreneurship. I thought about all the business associates who'd praised his independence and vision. "If I demanded recognition of my ownership stake," I asked slowly, "what would happen to Brian's reputation?" It would be severely damaged, James admitted. The business community doesn't forgive this kind of misrepresentation easily. His credibility would be shot, and the company's valuation would probably take a significant hit. On the other hand, if he continues down this path and the SEC discovers ownership issues during their IPO review, the consequences would be much worse. Criminal charges, potentially. I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, at the city where I'd built my business and raised my son and thought I understood the rules of success and family loyalty. Give me some time to think about this, James. But in the meantime, I want you to prepare documentation on everything. Every agreement, every payment, every legal basis for my ownership claim. If I decide to act, I want to be prepared. Of course, he said, already making notes. But Maggie, I have to ask, are you prepared for the possibility that this could destroy your relationship with Brian permanently? Because once you challenge his version of events publicly, there's no going back to the way things were. I thought about my son introducing me as a family friend, about him dismissing me as a gold digger who didn't understand business, about 5 years of sitting quietly while he took credit for my investments and advice. James, I said slowly, I think he destroyed our relationship the moment he decided I was an embarrassment rather than a partner. I just didn't realize it yet. On the drive home, I found myself taking a detour past Tech Flow Solutions' downtown offices. The building was sleek and modern, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky. A small plaque by the entrance listed the building's tenants, and there it was. Tech Flow Solutions, founded 2019, Brian Sullivan, CEO. No mention of partners, investors, or the woman whose money had made it all possible. I sat in my car across the street, watching young professionals in expensive suits hurry in and out of the building, and I realized that somewhere in those gleaming offices, my son was probably preparing for another day of meetings and presentations, where he would continue to present himself as a self-made entrepreneur. He would shake hands and sign contracts, and make decisions about a company that legally belonged almost as much to me as it did to him. The woman who had given him life, who had sacrificed everything for his success, who had quietly funded his dreams while asking for nothing in return except the pride of watching him achieve them, had become a footnote in his success story. But footnotes, I was beginning to understand, could sometimes become the most important part of the text. 3 weeks passed after my meeting with James, 3 weeks of careful observation and growing clarity about just how deep Brian's deception ran. I started paying attention to things I'd previously overlooked. The way he deflected questions about early investors at family dinners, how he'd casually mentioned that Madison's father was impressed with his financial independence. The subtle ways he'd been rewriting our shared history to cast himself as the sole architect of his success. The wedding planning, meanwhile, had kicked into high gear. Madison had apparently decided that since Brian was so successful and self-sufficient, they should spare no expense on what she kept calling the social event of the season. The venue alone was costing more than most people made in 2 years, and the guest list read like a who's who of Chicago's business and social elite. Everyone who mattered would be there to witness Brian's transformation from a modest background to the highest echelons of society. What really stung me was how little they seemed to value my presence at these planning sessions. When they bothered to include me at all, it was with the kind of patronizing patience you'd show to an elderly relative who didn't quite understand modern customs. Madison would explain decisions that had already been made, speaking slowly and using small words, as if the complexity of choosing between gold and ivory table linens might overwhelm my simple mind. "We've decided on the Symphony Center for the reception," Madison announced during one of these sessions, held at Alina Patterson's magnificent Mile penthouse. "Daddy pulled some strings to get us the main hall. It'll be absolutely perfect for our 500 guests." 500 guests. I tried to imagine how many of those people knew the truth about Tech Flow Solutions funding, how many had heard Brian's carefully crafted stories about building everything from scratch. Probably none of them had ever met the woman whose money had made his success possible. "That sounds lovely," I said, playing my assigned role as the grateful future mother-in-law who was lucky to be included in such elite circles. But inside, I was calculating. 500 of Chicago's most influential business leaders, all gathered to celebrate my son's achievement, all believing a story that was fundamentally false. It was during one of these wedding planning meetings that I overheard a conversation that finally pushed me past the point of quiet endurance. Madison and her mother were discussing the wedding program, specifically the biographical section about the bride and groom that would be included for guests. For Brian's section, Alina was saying, reading from her notes, we'll want to emphasize his self-made success, how he built TechFlow from nothing with just his own vision and determination. It's such an inspiring story, and it shows our guests exactly the kind of man Madison is marrying. Absolutely, Madison agreed. And we should mention the upcoming IPO. Daddy says it'll probably value the company at over $60 million now. Can you imagine? Brian created all that value entirely on his own. $60 million. The company's estimated value had increased by another $10 million. Since my meeting with James, which meant my 47% stake was now worth over $28 million. I was listening to my future daughter-in-law celebrate wealth that legally belonged almost as much to me as it did to the man she was marrying, wealth that existed only because of investments she didn't even know had been made. That evening, I called James and told him I was ready to move forward, not with immediate legal action, but with something more surgical, more precisely targeted. I want to attend the IPO announcement party, I told him. Brian mentioned it's being held next month at the Renaissance Hotel. All the major investors will be there, along with the business media and potential shareholders. Maggie, James said carefully, what are you planning? I'm planning to tell the truth, I replied. Brian wants to present himself as a self-made entrepreneur in front of everyone who matters in Chicago business. Fine, but they're going to hear the complete story, including the parts he's been leaving out. James was quiet for a moment. You realize this will effectively end any chance of reconciliation with your son. Once you challenge his narrative publicly, especially in front of investors and media, there's no walking it back. I thought about Brian introducing me as a family friend, about him calling me a gold digger, about 5 years of watching him take credit for my sacrifices and investments. James, he ended our relationship the moment he decided I was something to be ashamed of rather than someone to be proud of. I'm just finally accepting reality. Over the next 2 weeks, James and I prepared meticulously. He assembled a complete legal file documenting my ownership stake, including copies of all loan agreements, conversion clauses, and evidence of my strategic involvement in the company's development. We researched securities law regarding disclosure requirements and prepared a presentation that would be both legally unassailable and impossible to ignore. I also did something that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. I hired a private investigator to document Brian's public statements about TechFlow's funding. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. Not only had he been consistently claiming the company was self-funded, but he'd been giving specific details about how he'd bootstrapped the operation using savings from early jobs and modest family support. The investigator provided me with video recordings of Brian speaking at entrepreneurship conferences, telling audiences of young business students about the importance of self-reliance and the satisfaction of building something entirely on your own. In one particularly painful clip, he talked about how his mother had always believed in him, but never really understood business well enough to be involved in the company's development. I never understood business well enough. The woman who'd built a $12 million company from nothing, who'd provided the strategic guidance that had helped him navigate every major decision in TechFlow's development, apparently didn't understand business. The irony was so bitter I almost laughed. But it was the final piece of evidence that sealed my decision completely. The investigator had obtained a copy of the presentation Brian would be giving at the IPO announcement party. In it, he specifically stated that TechFlow Solutions had never taken outside investment and had been built entirely through organic growth and reinvested profits. This wasn't just a case of hurt feelings or family drama anymore. This was securities fraud, plain and simple. Brian was preparing to take a company public while making materially false statements about its ownership structure and funding history. He was going to stand in front of potential investors and tell them lies that could cost them millions if the truth ever came out. The night before the IPO party, I lay awake thinking about the 7-year-old boy who used to fall asleep on my lap while I balanced checkbooks and planned work schedules. That little boy had grown up watching his mother work 18-hour days, had seen her sacrifice everything for his future, had promised he would never forget what she'd done for him. Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared, replaced by a man who saw his mother's love and sacrifice as something embarrassing, something that diminished rather than enhanced his achievements. I thought about what tomorrow would bring, about standing up in front of Chicago's business elite and telling them the truth about tech flow solutions. I thought about the look on Brian's face when he realized his carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in real time. I thought about the consequences for his reputation, his engagement, his future in business. And then I thought about the alternative, sitting quietly for the rest of my life, watching my son build a fortune on lies, seeing him celebrated as a self-made entrepreneur while the woman who'd made it all possible remained invisible. I thought about Madison and her family continuing to see me as a simple cleaning lady who'd gotten lucky enough to be connected to their brilliant, independent son-in-law. By morning, my decision was made. It was time for Chicago's business community to meet the real founder of Tech Flow Solutions. The Renaissance Hotel ballroom had been transformed into a showcase of corporate success. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in crisp white linens, each centerpiece a carefully arranged display of orchids that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The guest list read like a directory of Chicago's business elite, venture capitalists, investment bankers, technology executives, and financial journalists, all gathered to witness what was being billed as one of the year's most promising IPO announcements. I arrived early, wearing a navy blue suit that projected the kind of quiet authority I'd learned to cultivate over 19 years of running Sullivan Cleaning Services. James had insisted on meeting me in the hotel lobby beforehand, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 5 years' worth of documentation, proving my ownership stake in the company everyone had come to celebrate. "Last chance to reconsider," he said as we rode the elevator to the ballroom level. "Once you do this, there's no going back. Brian's reputation will be destroyed, and your relationship with him will be over permanently." I looked at my reflection in the polished elevator doors, seeing a woman who had spent too many years making herself invisible for the comfort of others. "James, my relationship with Brian ended the moment he decided I was something to be ashamed of. I'm just finally accepting that reality." The ballroom was already filling with Chicago's power brokers when we entered. I recognized faces from business magazines and newspaper financial sections, people whose investment decisions moved markets and whose approval could make or break careers. At the front of the room, a massive screen displayed the Tech Flow Solutions logo alongside bullet points, highlighting the company's growth trajectory and market position. Brian stood near the stage, resplendent in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's rent, surrounded by a circle of admirers who hung on his every word. Madison was at his side, wearing a dress that complemented his success perfectly, playing the role of the supportive fiancée who'd found herself a genuine business visionary. They looked like they belonged in this room, like they'd been born to occupy spaces where million-dollar decisions were made over cocktails and careful networking. I took a seat at a table toward the back, close enough to be seen but far enough away to avoid awkward pre-presentation small talk. Several people nodded politely in my direction, after 5 years of attending board meetings as a silent partner. Some faces were familiar, though none of them knew who I really was or why I was there. The presentation began with introductory remarks from Richard Patterson, who had apparently used his connections to arrange the venue and guest list. He spoke glowingly about Brian's entrepreneurial spirit, his bootstrap approach to building a successful company, and the inspiration he provided to young business leaders everywhere. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard concluded, "it's my pleasure to introduce a young man who embodies everything we value in American business. Someone who took an idea, a dream, and through sheer determination and self-reliance, built it into a company now valued at over $60 million. Please welcome the founder and CEO of TechFlow Solutions, Brian Sullivan. The applause was enthusiastic as Brian took the stage, his confident smile suggesting a man completely comfortable with his success and the story behind it. He began with the polished presentation style he'd perfected over years of investor meetings, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said, clicking to the first slide of his presentation. 5 years ago, TechFlow Solutions was nothing more than an idea and a determination to revolutionize how service industries manage their operations. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that we're preparing to take that idea public, offering investors the opportunity to participate in a truly organic success story. Organic success story. I watched him click through slides showing revenue growth, market penetration, and technological innovations, each one presented as evidence of his singular vision and execution. The narrative was seamless, compelling, and false. "What I'm most proud of," Brian continued, warming to his theme, "is that everything you see here was built without outside investment, without family money, without the kind of shortcuts that too many entrepreneurs rely on today. Every dollar of growth came from reinvested profits. Every strategic decision was made independently. Every achievement was earned through merit and hard work." I felt James tense beside me. We both knew we were watching a man commit securities fraud in real time, telling a room full of potential investors a story that was fundamentally untrue. But I forced myself to remain calm, to wait for the right moment to speak. Brian clicked onto a slide titled "Founder's Journey" and began telling the carefully crafted story of his bootstrap origins. He talked about sleeping on friends' couches during the early days, about eating ramen noodles to save money for development costs, about the satisfaction of building something entirely through his own efforts. The audience was captivated by this narrative of American entrepreneurial spirit, several people nodding approvingly as he described the challenges of maintaining creative control without outside interference. "The beauty of our approach," he said, "is that TechFlow has never been beholden to outside investors who might compromise our vision or demand returns that conflict with long-term growth. We've maintained complete independence, which has allowed us to make decisions based purely on what's best for the company and our clients." That was my cue. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room as attention shifted from the stage to the middle-aged woman who had just interrupted the presentation. Brian's confident smile faltered as he recognized me, confusion replacing the polished assurance he'd displayed moments earlier. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I think there might be some confusion about TechFlow's funding history." Brian's face went pale. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Mom," the word hung in the air like an admission of guilt. Around the room, I could see people putting the pieces together, realizing that the woman who had just challenged the presentation was the founder's mother, the same mother he'd been describing as uninvolved in his business success. "My name is Margaret Sullivan," I said, addressing the room rather than my son. "I'm the owner and CEO of Sullivan Cleaning Services, and I'm also the primary investor in TechFlow Solutions. Over the past 5 years, I've provided $2.3 million in funding for this company, which, according to the legal agreements my son signed, entitles me to 47% ownership." The silence in the room was deafening. I could see financial journalists reaching for their phones, investors exchanging alarmed glances, and Madison looking like she might faint. But I wasn't finished. "I've been attending board meetings for 5 years as what was described to me as a silent partner. But I'm beginning to understand that silent partnership and invisibility are two very different things." I nodded to James, who opened his briefcase and began distributing copies of the loan agreements to the nearest tables. "Everything you've heard tonight about organic growth and self-funding is false. This company exists because a mother believed in her son's vision and provided the capital to make it a reality." Brian found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than the confident baritone he'd been using moments earlier. This This is a family matter that doesn't belong in a business presentation. Securities fraud isn't a family matter, I replied calmly. And that's what you've been committing every time you've told investors that this company was self-funded. The SEC takes a very dim view of material misrepresentations in IPO proceedings. I could see Richard Patterson at a corner table, his face red with fury as he realized his future son-in-law had made him complicit in what was looking increasingly like a criminal enterprise. Madison was staring at Brian like she'd never seen him before, the carefully constructed image of the self-made entrepreneur crumbling in real time. Ladies and gentlemen, I concluded, I apologize for disrupting what was clearly intended to be a celebration. But I thought you deserved to know the truth about where your potential investment actually came from, and who's been making the strategic decisions that created the value you've been invited to purchase. The room erupted into chaos as journalists rushed toward me with questions. Investors demanded explanations, and Brian stood frozen on the stage like a man watching his entire world collapse around him. The chaos that followed my revelation was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Financial journalists swarmed toward me with recording devices and rapid-fire questions, while investors huddled in urgent conversations, their voices rising as they tried to understand the implications of what they'd just heard. Near the stage, Brian stood frozen, his polished presentation abandoned as his carefully constructed world crumbled in real time. Mrs. Sullivan, a reporter from the Chicago Business Journal, called out, "Can you verify the exact amount of your investment in TechFlow Solutions?" James stepped forward smoothly, his legal training taking over as he began distributing additional documentation. $2.3 million over 5 years, he said, with the precision of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. All documented through legally binding agreements that include equity conversion clauses. Mrs. Sullivan is not just an investor, she's the largest shareholder in this company. The word shareholder rippled through the crowd like electricity. I watched as several prominent venture capitalists, men who'd been nodding approvingly at Brian's bootstrap narrative just minutes earlier, now looked like they were calculating their potential legal exposure for attending what amounted to a fraudulent investment presentation. Richard Patterson emerged from the crowd, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Brian," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 3 generations of business success, "I think you need to explain what's happening here. Because if what this woman is saying is true, you've made my family complicit in securities fraud." Brian finally found his voice, though it bore little resemblance to the confident tone he'd used during his presentation. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said, his eyes darting between me, Richard, and the growing crowd of journalists. "My mother provided some early loans to help with startup costs, but she's not a business partner. She doesn't understand corporate structure or—" "I understand it well enough to know when I'm being erased from it," I interrupted, my voice calm, but carrying enough steel to cut through his protestations. "James, would you please read the ownership clause of the July 2020 funding agreement?" James pulled out a document and adjusted his reading glasses. "Upon conversion of outstanding loans to equity, Margaret Sullivan shall hold no less than 47% voting interest in TechFlow Solutions, with all attendant rights and responsibilities of majority shareholder status." He looked up at the crowd. This was signed by Brian Sullivan and witnessed by 2 independent parties. The number, 47%, sent another shock wave through the room. I could see people doing quick mental calculations, realizing that if the company was valued at $60 million, the woman they'd been ignoring owned $28 million, worth of stock in what was supposedly a self-funded startup. Madison appeared at Brian's side, her perfect composure finally cracking. "Brian, what is she talking about? You told me your mother ran a small cleaning business. You said she'd never contributed anything meaningful to your company." The words hung in the air like an accusation. I felt a moment of satisfaction watching my son realize that his dismissive comments about me had been overheard and remembered by the woman he was planning to marry. "Madison," I said gently, addressing her directly for the first time, I do run a cleaning business. It generates about $12 million in annual revenue and employs over 200 people. That's where the money came from to fund your fiancé's self-made success story. A reporter from Crane's Chicago business pushed forward with her phone recording. Mrs. Sullivan, are you saying that your son has been deliberately misrepresenting his company's ownership structure to potential investors? Before I could answer, Brian stepped down from the stage, his face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and anger. Mom, stop this. You're destroying everything I've worked for. Everything we've worked for? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. Brian, I've been working on this too. For 5 years, I've provided the capital, the strategic guidance, and the business experience that made this company possible. The only difference is that I've been doing it quietly, without taking credit, because I thought you needed to feel like you'd achieved something on your own. But you don't understand the technology sector, he protested, grasping for any argument that might restore his credibility. You don't understand venture capital or scaling operations or... I understand building a profitable business from nothing, I replied. I understand managing cash flow and growth strategies and personnel decisions. I understand what it takes to create value and maintain client relationships and survive in competitive markets. The technology is different, but business is business. Alina Patterson materialized beside her husband, her social training allowing her to maintain composure even as her family's reputation was being destroyed in real time. Richard, she said quietly, I think we need to leave, immediately. But Richard wasn't ready to retreat. His political instincts told him that distancing himself from this disaster required Getty. NG the complete story first. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, his voice carefully neutral, are you planning to pursue legal action regarding your son's misrepresentation of the company's ownership? It was the question everyone in the room wanted answered, the one that would determine whether this was just a family drama or a criminal matter with far-reaching consequences. I looked at Brian, seeing not the confident entrepreneur who'd been presenting just minutes earlier, but the little boy who used to fall asleep on my lap while I worked late into the night. That depends, I said slowly, on whether my son is prepared to tell the truth about how this company was really built and who really owns it. The ballroom had gone completely silent except for the soft clicking of phone cameras and the scratch of reporters taking notes. Every eye was on Brian, waiting to see how he would respond to his mother's ultimatum. He looked around the room at the faces of investors he'd hoped to impress, journalists who would shape his public narrative, and social connections that could make or break his future in Chicago business. Then he looked at Madison, whose expression had shifted from shock to something approaching disgust. I need to think, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. No, I replied, my patience finally exhausted after 5 years of watching him take credit for my work. You need to decide, right here, right now, in front of everyone who came here to invest in your supposed self-made success. Are you going to continue lying about where this company came from, or are you going to acknowledge the truth about who's been your partner all along? The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with 19 years of love and sacrifice and disappointment. Around us, Chicago's business elite waited to see whether they were witnessing a family reconciliation or the complete destruction of a young entrepreneur's career. Brian opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Madison stepped forward. I think, she said with the icy precision of someone who'd been raised to cut losses quickly, that Brian and I need to have a very serious conversation about honesty and partnership. She turned on her heel and walked toward the exit, her designer shoes clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. Richard and Alina Patterson followed without a word, leaving Brian standing alone on the stage he'd climbed with such confidence just an hour earlier. The message was clear. The Patterson family was distancing themselves from this disaster as quickly and completely as possible. The engagement, the wedding, the social elevation that marriage into their family would have provided, all of it was evaporating in real time. Well, said a voice from the crowd, This is certainly more interesting than most IPO presentations. Despite everything, despite the pain and anger and disappointment of the past month, I almost smiled. Because for the first time in 5 years, everyone in the room knew exactly who had really built Tech Flow Solutions. The exodus began immediately. Within minutes of Madison's dramatic departure, half the room was heading for the exits, leaving behind untouched appetizers and half-empty glasses of champagne that had been meant to toast Brian's success. The investors, especially, seemed eager to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming the most spectacular business scandal Chicago had seen in years. But the journalists weren't going anywhere. If anything, they'd moved closer, sensing that the real story was just beginning. I found myself surrounded by reporters from the Chicago Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, and Crane's Chicago Business, all firing questions about my role in Tech Flow's development and what I planned to do with my newfound public profile as the company's primary investor. "Mrs. Sullivan," asked Jennifer Chen from the Tribune, "what was your involvement in the day-to-day operations of Tech Flow Solutions?" Before I could answer, Brian stepped down from the stage, his face a mixture of desperation and fury. "She wasn't involved in operations," he said, inserting himself into the interview. "She provided some early funding, yes, but the strategic decisions, the technology development, the business model, all of that was my work." James cleared his throat and pulled out another document. "Actually, I have email records going back 5 years showing Mrs. Sullivan's input on hiring decisions, client acquisition strategies, and operational scaling plans. Her business experience was consistently sought out and implemented throughout the company's development." The evidence was damning and thorough. James had prepared for this moment meticulously, and every claim Brian made was immediately countered with documentation proving my involvement. Email threads showing my advice on personnel issues. Financial projections I'd helped develop based on my expertise. NCE growing Sullivan Cleaning Services. Strategic recommendations that had been implemented word for word in Tech Flow's business plan. "This is ridiculous," Brian protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're taking casual conversations and making them sound like formal business consultations." Casual conversations. I finally spoke, my patience completely exhausted. "Brian, when you called me at 11 o'clock at night asking how to handle the Johnson contract dispute, was that casual? When you spent 3 hours in my office going over employee retention strategies after your first round of layoffs, was that casual? When you implemented the entire client relationship management system I developed for Sullivan Cleaning Services, was that casual?" The reporters were scribbling furiously, capturing every word of what was becoming a public dismantling of Brian's carefully constructed narrative. I could see them already crafting headlines. "Tech startup built on mother's hidden investment. The real story behind Chicago's self-made CEO. From cleaning services to software. A mother's secret business empire." Richard Patterson, who had started to leave with his family, stopped near the exit and turned back toward our group. His political instincts had apparently told him that running away might look worse than staying to assess the damage. He approached with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. When we met at the engagement party, I made certain assumptions about your background and your relationship to Brian's success. Those assumptions were clearly incorrect." It was as close to an admission of error as someone like Richard Patterson was likely to make in public. I could see him calculating the social and political costs of having been so thoroughly wrong about the people he was welcoming into his family. "Apology accepted," I replied graciously. "Though I should mention that my small cleaning business manages facilities for several companies you probably do business with, including Patterson Holdings." The revelation that his own business empire was connected to mine, that the woman he'd dismissed as a simple cleaning lady provided services to his company, sent another shock wave through his carefully composed expression. Meanwhile, Brian was growing increasingly desperate as he watched his social and professional world collapse around him. "Mom, please," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Can we discuss this privately? You're destroying my reputation, my engagement, my entire future. Your reputation was built on lies, I replied quietly. Your engagement was based on deception, and your future, that depends on whether you're finally ready to acknowledge the truth about how you got here. Dr. Patricia Williams, a business professor from Northwestern who'd been observing the entire exchange, stepped forward. Mrs. Sullivan, from an academic perspective, what you're describing sounds like a classic case of female entrepreneurship being systematically erased from business narratives. Would you say that's an accurate assessment? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the personal betrayal, the family dynamics, and the legal implications that I hadn't considered the broader social significance of what had happened. But as I thought about it, I realized she was right. I suppose it is, I said slowly. I built my business the way many women do, quietly, methodically, without a lot of fanfare or press attention. When I invested in Brian's company, I did it the same way. I didn't demand recognition or public credit because I didn't think I needed it. I just wanted to help my son succeed. And in doing so, Dr. Williams continued, you became invisible in your own success story. Your son took credit not just for the money you provided, but for the business expertise you developed over 2 decades of entrepreneurship. The academic framing of the situation seemed to crystallize something for the journalists. This wasn't just a story about family drama or securities fraud. It was a story about how women's contributions to business get erased, how success gets redefined to exclude the people who make it possible. Jennifer Chen from the Tribune looked up from her notes. Mrs. Sullivan, do you think your son would have achieved this level of success without your investment and guidance? It was the question that cut to the heart of everything. I looked at Brian, standing there in his expensive suit, his carefully styled hair now disheveled from running his hands through it, his confidence completely shattered. No, I said simply. He wouldn't have. Not because he lacks talent or vision, he has both in abundance, but because building a successful business requires more than good ideas. It requires capital, experience, strategic thinking, and the wisdom that comes from years of making mistakes and learning fro. Them. I provided all of that, and I've been erased from the story. The admission seemed to break something in Brian. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time in years, I saw traces of the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when he was scared or hurt. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I wanted them to respect me for what I'd accomplished, not for what you'd given me. It was the first genuine thing he'd said all evening, and despite everything, the hurt, the anger, the public humiliation, I felt my heart soften slightly. Brian, I said gently, what I gave you was an opportunity. What you accomplished with that opportunity is real, and it's impressive, and it's something to be proud of. But it's not something you did alone, and pretending otherwise doesn't make you more successful. It just makes you dishonest. The crowd of reporters and remaining guests had gone quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something more profound than a business scandal. This was a moment of reckoning, a son finally understanding the cost of denying his mother's contributions to his success. What happens now? Brian asked, looking around the mostly empty ballroom that was supposed to have been the scene of his greatest triumph. I looked at James, who nodded almost imperceptibly. We had discussed this possibility, the moment when Brian might be ready to face the truth and make things right. Now, I said, you're going to learn what it really means to have a business partner. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Tech Flow Solutions, looking out at the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that no longer felt foreign to me. The nameplate on the door read, Margaret Sullivan, co-CEO, and the business cards in my desk drawer carried both my name and the title I'd earned but never claimed, co-founder. The company's official website now told the complete story of Tech Flow's origins, including the strategic partnership between a technology visionary and an experienced business operator whose combined expertise had created something neither could have achieved alone. The transformation wasn't easy. The IPO had been delayed for 8 months, while lawyers sorted through the ownership restructuring, and the SEC conducted a thorough review of our corrected filings. Several potential investors had walked away entirely, spooked by the initial misrepresentation and the media coverage that had made tech flow a cautionary tale about transparency in business partnerships. But others were intrigued by the story of a successful mother-son business team, and our eventual public offering had been fully subscribed at a valuation of $55 million. My 47% stake was now worth just over $25 million, making me one of the wealthiest women in Chicago. More importantly, I was finally receiving credit for 19 years of business expertise that had been applied not just to Sullivan Cleaning Services, but to building tech flow into a market leader in service industry software. Brian knocked on my office door and entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of expression that had become familiar over the past months, part contrition, part respect, and part genuine affection for the business partner he'd finally learned to acknowledge. "The quarterly numbers are in," he said, setting 1 cup on my desk. "We're up 18% from last quarter, and the client retention rate is at 94%. I smiled, remembering all the conversations we'd had about customer service strategies, relationship management, and the importance of delivering consistent value. Those had been casual conversations once upon a time. Now they were recognized as strategic planning sessions between 2 experienced business operators. "The Johnson Group signed their expansion contract," I added, pulling up the file on my computer. "They're adding 3 more facilities to our management system. That puts us at just over $8 million in annual recurring revenue from that account alone." Brian nodded, making notes in the leather portfolio that had replaced his phone as his primary organizational tool. We'd learned to communicate differently over the past months, more like the business partners we'd always been rather than the mother and son trying to navigate complex family dynamics. The media attention had been intense initially, but it had also brought unexpected opportunities. Harvard Business School had invited us to speak about family business partnerships and gender dynamics in entrepreneurship. The Chicago Women's Business Association had given me their Entrepreneur of the Year award. Sullivan Cleaning Services had seen a 30% increase in new contracts from companies that wanted to work with the woman who built Tech Flow. Madison, predictably, ended the engagement within a week of the IPO presentati. On Disaster, the last I'd heard, she was dating a hedge fund manager whose family wealth was old enough and established enough to meet Patterson standards. Brian had been hurt initially, but I could see now that it had been for the best. She'd been in love with the idea of Brian as a self-made entrepreneur, not with Brian himself. "Any word from the Patterson family?" I asked, knowing the answer but curious about Brian's perspective. "Richard called yesterday," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Apparently they're having issues with their facility management vendor, and he wondered if Sullivan Cleaning Services might be interested in bidding on the contract." The irony was delicious. Richard Patterson, who had once dismissed me as a simple cleaning lady who didn't understand his sophisticated business world, was now actively seeking out my services. Money, it turned out, had a way of clarifying people's perspectives on competence and value. "Did you tell him our rates have gone up?" I asked with a slight smile. "I told him he'd need to discuss pricing with the CEO of Sullivan Cleaning Services directly," Brian replied. "I also mentioned that our client retention rate is higher than his hedge fund's return rate." It was the kind of response that the old Brian, desperate for social acceptance and validation from established wealth, never would have made. The months since the IPO presentation had changed him in ways that went beyond simply acknowledging my role in the business. He'd developed a confidence that came from earned respect rather than inherited status. My assistant knocked and entered, reminding us that the board meeting was starting in 10 minutes. Tech Flow's board now included 3 independent directors, all of whom had been briefed on the complete history of the company's development and were comfortable working with a co-CEO structure. The days of me sitting silently in the back of the room were over. As we walked toward the boardroom, Brian stopped in the hallway and turned to face me. Mom, I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry. Not just for the lies and the credit taking, but for making you feel like you had to be invisible to support my success. I studied his face, seeing the man he'd become rather than the boy he'd been. Brian, we both made mistakes. I enabled your behavior by allowing myself to be erased from the story. I thought I was protecting your pride, but I was actually teaching you that my contributions didn't matter. They always mattered, he said quietly. I just wasn't mature enough to admit it. The boardroom was full when we entered, with directors dialing in from New York and San Francisco for our quarterly review. As Brian began presenting the operational updates, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us here, from a single mother scrubbing floors at midnight to a co-CEO of a publicly traded technology company. After the meeting, as the sun set over Lake Michigan and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, I called James Morrison to give him the quarterly update he'd been requesting. The legal bills for our restructuring were substantial, but the result was worth every penny. "How's the partnership working out?" he asked, the satisfaction clear in his voice. James had been advocating for transparency from the beginning, and watching his client finally receive proper recognition had been professionally gratifying. "Better than I expected," I admitted. "Turns out that once you stop hiding your contributions, people actually appreciate your expertise." And Brian. I looked across the office where my son was working late, preparing for a client presentation that would showcase technology solutions developed through our combined expertise. He's learning that success is more satisfying when it's honest. That evening, I drove home to my house on Maple Street, the same house where I'd raised Brian and built Sullivan Cleaning Services and dreamed about possibilities I'd never imagined could become a reality. The house looked the same, but I felt fundamentally different walking through its rooms. I was no longer Margaret Sullivan, the invisible woman whose sacrifices enabled other people's success. I was Margaret Sullivan, co-founder and co-CEO of TechFlow Solutions, owner of Sullivan Cleaning Services, and living proof that sometimes the most important business partnerships are built on love, sacrifice, and the courage to demand recognition for your contributions. The next morning's Chicago Tribune business section featured an article about TechFlow's quarterly results, with a photo of Brian and me reviewing financial projections in our shared conference room. The caption read, "Co-CEOs Brian and Margaret Sullivan discuss expansion plans for TechFlow Solutions, the mother-son technology partnership that has become a model for family business collaboration." A model for family business collaborati. I smiled as I read those words, thinking about all the mothers and daughters and sisters who had built businesses quietly, without recognition, believing that invisibility was the price of supporting someone else's dreams. Sometimes, I'd learned, the most radical thing you can do is refuse to be invisible in your own success story. As I sit here in my office at TechFlow Solutions, watching the sun set over Chicago's skyline, I often think about the lessons this journey has taught me, lessons that took me 64 years to learn, but that I hope other women might discover sooner. The first lesson is about the difference between supporting someone and erasing yourself. For years, I believed that true love meant making myself invisible so Brian could shine brighter. I thought that stepping back, staying quiet, and letting him take credit was what good mothers did. But I learned that when you erase yourself from your own success story, you don't just hurt yourself. You rob your children of the chance to truly understand what strength and sacrifice look like. The second lesson is about the value of documentation. Every contract I signed, every email I saved, every agreement James Morrison insisted on including protection clauses in, that paper trail became my lifeline when the truth needed to be told. In business and in life, your contributions matter only if you can prove they happened. Don't trust that love and family loyalty will be enough to protect your interests. Trust, but verify. The third lesson, and perhaps the most important one, is about the courage to claim your place. I spent 5 years attending board meetings as a silent partner, watching my son take credit for strategies I'd developed and investments I'd made. I told myself I was being supportive, but I was being complicit in my own erasure. The night I stood up in that ballroom and spoke the truth about TechFlow's real founding story was the night I finally learned to value my own voice. Today, Sullivan Cleaning Services and TechFlow Solutions operate as sister companies, sharing resources and expertise in ways that have benefited both organizations. Brian has become not just a better business partner, but a better man. One who understands that acknowledging other people's contributions doesn't diminish your own achievements, it enhances them. Our relationship isn't the same as it was when he was 7 years old and I was his whole world. But it's honest now, built on mutual respect rather than convenient fiction. He calls me Margaret in board meetings and Mom at family dinners, and both feel right in their proper contexts. For the women reading this who recognize themselves in my story, the mothers funding their children's dreams, the wives building businesses behind their husband's success, the daughters supporting family enterprises without recognition, I want you to know that your contributions matter. Your expertise has value. Your sacrifices deserve acknowledgement. And for the children who have built their success on foundations laid by others, remember that recognizing your partners doesn't make you less impressive. It makes you honest. The strongest leaders I've met are those who understand that great achievements are rarely solo performances. Brian learned that lesson the hard way, in front of Chicago's business elite and financial press. But he learned it. And now, when young entrepreneurs ask him about TechFlow's success, he tells them the complete story. About vision and technology and innovation, yes, but also about the experienced business partner whose expertise and investment made it all possible. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Sometimes love means refusing to stay invisible, even when visibility comes with conflict. And sometimes the most important thing you can teach your children is that real success, the kind that lasts, is built on honesty, partnership, and the courage to share credit where credit is due. The woman who started this story scrubbing floors at midnight is the same woman who ends it as co-CEO of a $50 million company. The difference isn't in what I accomplished, it's in finally demanding recognition for accomplishments that were always mine. That recognition didn't come easy, and it didn't come without cost. But it came. And for the first time in my life, when I look in the mirror, I see someone who refuses to be invisible in her own success story. That, I've learned, makes all the difference.